My name's Mike Carroll. I'm a manager here at Risk 360 and the HITRUST practice lead. And today I wanted to give an overview of the HITRUST framework and talk a little bit about the certification process. So our agenda for today, a couple different topics that we're going to dive into. The first is defining roles and responsibilities. So within HITRUST, it's a three-party system. So we'll talk about what those three parties are and dive a little bit into what the roles and responsibilities of each party are throughout a HITRUST assessment. Next, we'll talk about what is HITRUST. After that, we'll talk about the business context of HITRUST. This is essentially the why. What's the purpose of pursuing a HITRUST certification and what does it do for my business? Next, we'll talk about the HITRUST assessment domains. What you need to know is that there's 19 separate domains and you'll need to be in compliance with each in order to receive your certification. After that, we'll talk about HITRUST's scoring methodology. So the way that we test controls for HITRUST is a little bit different from other frameworks like SOC 2 or ISO. So we'll dive into some of the nuances with respect to HITRUST. After that, we'll talk about the four-step process. So at Risk 360, there's essentially 4 steps that we take with each client to walk them through a certification. So we'll dive into those and talk about what goes into each step. And then lastly, we'll talk about what a typical timeline looks like for certification. So first thing to know is for HITRUST, it's actually a three-party system, which is a little bit different from what you might expect in a traditional audit. So in a traditional audit, there's really 2 parties that are involved. It's going to be the entity being assessed and then the assessor. HITRUST adds in a third party here, which is actually the HITRUST Alliance themselves. So the assessed entities, essentially the company that's being assessed, otherwise referred to as a subscriber, they have responsibilities for facilitating communications to their stakeholders, so making sure that anyone who's involved in the assessment is aware of what is expected of them in the assessment. They have to provide accurate and timely information to the external assessor. They're actually responsible for maintaining compliance with the controls over time and making sure that they retain documentation that supports this. And lastly, they're responsible for continuously improving their system. So that's a topic that those of you who are familiar with ISO may be aware of, but making sure that not only do you maintain the status quo, but that you're also constantly looking for ways to improve your information security program. The next party is the external assessor, and this would be a firm like Risk 360 who's actually performing the audit. So their responsibility is really overall just to be your guide throughout the entire process. There's a pretty extensive process that assessors go through in order to be able to recommend companies for certification. So they should be aware of everything that you need to do along the way to receive that certification. They're generally going to lead the HITRUST readiness activities, doing a current state assessment, which would result in you getting a feel for what your compliance system currently looks like in comparison to the controls that you have to be in compliance with. After that, a lot of the times they're going to guide you through a remediation period. And lastly, they're going to conduct the HITRUST validated assessment. This is what you're probably used to with most assessor firms. They're going to be on site, although in this COVID era, it's usually a virtual on-site, quote unquote, but they will be actually testing audit evidence to see if you're actually in compliance with the requirements. Lastly, they're responsible for submitting your HITRUST assessment up to the HITRUST Alliance, where the HITRUST Alliance will actually perform their own independent QA. This consists of them looking at the work that was performed by the external assessors, and if they're in agreement with the work, if they're able to get some comfort that it meets the standard assurance process, they will issue you the certification, assuming that you meet some specific guidelines or criteria that we'll talk about later on in this slideshow. So just to back up a bit, we'll talk about what is HITRUST. So HITRUST, meaning the CSF, is a risk management framework that is actually established and governed by the HITRUST Alliance, which is its own entity. So the HITRUST CSF, or the framework, incorporates a lot of concepts from ISO 27001 and NIST 853. It actually maps back to more than 40 standards, but it maps closest and is built off of the ISO and the NIST framework. So if you're familiar with those requirements, a lot of what you'll see in HITRUST should be familiar to you. The HITRUST framework itself is updated at least annually, although it's usually a little bit more often than this, sometimes 2 or 3 times per year. The most recent version, version 9.6, was issued in December of 2021, although version 10 is set to be released by the end of Q1. That's going to be a pretty significant overhaul of some of the requirements in the program itself, so we're looking forward to that in the near future. The third thing here, and this is what's, again, a little bit different from your typical assessment, the HITRUST report itself is actually issued by the HITRUST Alliance after they complete that QA process that I mentioned a little while ago. So it's not going to be your external assessor firm that issues the actual report. You're going to receive it directly from the HITRUST Alliance. Then the last point here, I touched on this a little bit, but HITRUST validated assessments and the testing for those assessments can only be performed by an authorized external assessor. These external assessor firms need to meet certain requirements in order to maintain their status as an external assessor, and you can find a list of them on HITRUST's website. So the business context of HITRUST. There's really no easy way to say it. HITRUST can be a bit of a bear. There's a lot of requirements. So you're probably asking yourself, why should I pursue this? What do I get out of it? The first thing is that this helps demonstrate that you're in compliance with different regulations, right? So if you want to make sure that you are in compliance with something like GDPR or HIPAA, HITRUST is great for this. Like I mentioned before, it maps back to 40 frameworks. So although it is a bit of a burden in terms of proving compliance, usually with about 300 requirements, the benefit to that is you can leverage a single assessment to show that you're in compliance with multiple standards or regulations or different frameworks. So there's a huge upside there. I'm going to tie numbers 2 and 4 in together, but third-party due diligence is a really big deal. Everyone talks about it. Third-party risk is something that's very significant to businesses. So if you're looking at working with a potential vendor, a lot of companies want to make sure that those vendors are buttoned up and are able to effectively protect any data that might be shared with them. So what a HITRUST certification does for you is if you've got a prospect or a customer who needs some assurance on your information security program, HITRUST is really considered the golden standard. So you can demonstrate that you take information security very seriously. And again, it gives them a high level of assurance to do business with you. One of the benefits to this is that we've seen it actually expedite a lot of sales cycles. So when companies are trying to sell their products or their services, there can sometimes be lengthy questionnaires that they need to complete before a prospect or a customer will want to do business with them. A lot of those same prospects or customers will accept a HITRUST certification in lieu of those questionnaires, so you're able to help expedite that sales cycle a bit. And the last piece here, I know it's number 3, but security governance. So if you want just a good assessment to make sure that you're keeping up with industry standards, this is a great way to do it. So the HITRUST CSF, the framework itself, has a very robust framework, but it's also flexible so that you can tweak it a little bit to make sure that it's very specific to your business. So the HITRUST assessment domains, a lot of these topics are very common across multiple frameworks, but the big point that I want to make here is that you can't just be an expert in one of these and receive a HITRUST certification. You have to meet a certain threshold, which is essentially just a level of compliance in each of the domains in order to receive your certification. If you're an expert in 18 of these domains, but you fail just one, you're not going to receive your HITRUST certification. So you do have to have a very well-rounded information security program in order to receive your certification. The next thing I wanted to talk about, and I know when you get out of high school, you think you're done with math for a little bit, but not quite. So HITRUST has a very unique scoring methodology. So there's going to be usually around 300 requirement statements that you need to be in compliance with, and there's up to 5 maturity levels that you're going to be assessed against as far as those requirement statements are concerned. So what you have to know is, let's use an example requirement statement. So you'll see it at the top. User identities are verified prior to establishing accounts. So essentially what we're looking for here is that you've got some process to validate that someone is who they say they are before you create a system account for them. Now, there's going to be 5 different components that we could look at potentially against this requirement. The first 3 are almost always looked at. So it's going to be policy, process, and implementation. So as far as the policy is concerned, we want to make sure, do you have a policy statement that requires this control to be in place at your business? So all that we're really looking for here is just a statement, kind of the thou shalt type of statements saying that you do require this at your company. The next thing is process. So going a little bit deeper, we want to make sure that not only have you established this requirement in your policies, but that you've got formalized procedures that describe how they're carried out. So a good procedure might look like, your vice president of HR completes a background check on someone and validates that they are who they claim to be before an account is generated by IT. The third thing is your implemented. So this is how you want to prove that the control's actually in place. So we looked at your policy document, we looked at your procedure or your process. Now we want to make sure that the control has actually been implemented. So in order to prove out the implemented level, we would likely look at that actual background check, maybe for a sample of new hires, to make sure that you're actually performing the control. Measured and managed are usually looked at a little bit less, and there's good reason for that. 100% of these scores are going to be QA'd by HITRUST, and on top of that, you get significantly less bang for your buck. The two of those combined only give you 25% of the total score, whereas if you look at implemented, process, and policy combined, those equal 75% of the score. So we talked about how for each requirement statement, there's 5 potential levels that you're going to be assessed against. Again, usually most assessor firms will only look at the first 3 unless they need to boost your score. So let's say for policy, you're fully compliant here, right? You've got a policy statement that clearly lays out this requirement. In that case, we would mark this as being fully compliant, as you can see to the bottom left of my screen. So you'd receive 100%, and we're going to multiply that by the 15% of the requirement statement that policy comprises. So we multiply 100 times 15, we get 15 total points towards my overall requirement statement. The next is process. So let's say our process, we have one in place, but it doesn't address all the attributes that we want to see. In that case, we would get mostly compliant, which gives us 75% of the total score that we could get for the process maturity level. So we would take that 75%, we're going to multiply it by the 20% that process comprises for the overall requirement statement. So that gives us another 15 points towards our overall requirement score. The last one we're going to look at in this example is going to be the implemented score. So let's say when our assessors come on site, they're able to validate that for all of our sampled new hires, that those individuals had background checks completed before an account was created for them. That's great. They get fully compliant here. So we're going to multiply that 100 by 40% because the implemented score is 40% of my overall requirement statement. So again, measured and managed, we won't look at those as much, so we're going to exclude those from this example. What you'll see when we add up those 3 scores is that we get a total requirement score of 70. Now, if I go back to the previous slide, there's a little note at the bottom that says, for each domain, you need a score of at least 62 to pass the domain. So if I go back to this example, this requirement statement happens to be under domain 11, which is access control. So this one requirement scored at 70. Let's say that I had 10 requirements that roll up under that access control domain. As long as the average of those 10 requirements equals 62 or above, I'm eligible for certification for that particular domain. I would essentially have to repeat that process for all 19 domains, again, making sure that I'm above that 62 threshold in order to be eligible for a HITRUST certification. So the next thing I wanted to walk through is the 4-step process overview. This is really the 4 steps that we'll take with our clients at Risk 360 to walk them through the entire life cycle of a HITRUST assessment. The first thing is scoping and planning. This is very important. So one of the other nuances with HITRUST is that 2 companies will rarely have the same control set. As part of the onboarding process, your external assessor will work with you in the MyCSF tool, where you're going to answer a standardized questionnaire. The way that you answer the questions in that questionnaire will derive the requirements that are applicable to you. So at the end of that process, we'll identify what's the scope of the assessment, we'll answer that questionnaire, and we'll know which requirements out of the total pool, and HITRUST has thousands of potential requirements, but which ones are applicable to me. Those are the only requirements that I'm going to be assessed against. The next part here is going to be readiness, and I'm also going to loop remediation in here. But really what this phase consists of is first conducting just that, a gap assessment or a readiness assessment. So what that looks like is as the external assessor, we'll go on site and we'll get just a current day snapshot of where you are in terms of your requirement statements, how you score those, and we'll compare them to where you need to be, which again is that 62-point threshold for each domain. So at the end of the gap assessment, we'll be able to compare your domain scores to what you need for certification. And we'll even go a step further. We're going to score each requirement to let you know specifically what do you need to remediate in order to be eligible for certification. Once we go into that, you'll dive into a period of remediation. That consists of you remediating those gaps to make sure that you reach a level that's certifiable under the HITRUST standard. One of the things that's very nice about HITRUST having their own independent QA process is that the assessor firms have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they can help you with remediation. For a lot of frameworks, the assessors have to be very hands-off, thinking about like ISO 27001 or SOC 2. For HITRUST, it's very rare that an assessor is actually going to implement a control for you, but they're able to provide you a lot more guidance than they could under a different type of framework. Once you're all set with your remediation, there's a bit of a cool-off period that I'll dive into in just a minute. But once that remediation period and the cool-off period are over, you'll dive into your audit fieldwork. And this is really the certification audit. So again, we're going to look at all of your requirement statements, at least the policy, the process, and the maturity level. We're going to score all those, and once testing is completed, we'll submit that assessment up to HITRUST for their independent QA process. Once the report gets submitted to HITRUST, they'll perform that QA process. If they have any questions, they're normally going to vet those out with your external assessor, and they might get you involved as well. And once they've reached agreement on the scores, as long as you're eligible for certification, they will issue you the certificate stating that you're now HITRUST certified. So the last thing that I want to do is just kind of show a typical timeline. And what we'll see for a first-time client seeking HITRUST certification, it's usually about a 1-year process for them to get certified. So the first thing that we'll do really in month 1, let's say we're operating off of a typical calendar year, it'll take about a month or so to figure out all of the scoping, all of the planning, just getting ready for that gap assessment. After that, it'll usually take about 6 to 8 weeks to complete the gap assessment. A lot of this is inquiry-based, but we also spend a good amount of time looking at policies and procedures, making sure that you're buttoned up there. The third thing we'll dive into is remediation, and this is the one that can really vary pretty significantly depending on the output of your gap assessment. If when we get out of the gap assessment, we see that there's just very minor tweaks that have to be made, maybe just have to update a couple policies and procedures, remediation is going to be very short for you. If we identify some very significant gaps, let's say you have to implement a pretty significant tool or technology like a SIM solution, that might take a little bit longer. So the remediation timelines can vary pretty significantly, but I would say this should take anywhere from about 1 to 6 months as long as you've got adequate resources to support your program. Another thing that's built into remediation is that before any controls can be tested for HITRUST, they have to be in place for at least 90 days. So what that means for you is after you're done with remediation, you still have another 3-month period before the controls can be tested for your validated assessment. So keep that in mind when you're trying to plan this out for your organization. The last part of this is completing the validated assessment. This usually takes anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And again, this consists of your assessor being on site, collecting evidence, policies, procedures, and actual implementations of your controls, scoring them within the MyCSF, which is the platform that we'll use in order to conduct this assessment, and then submitting that assessment up to HITRUST. HITRUST will then complete their QA. That usually takes a couple of weeks, and after that's done, you will get your report in hand. Thanks for joining us today, and we appreciate your time.